Right, morning everyone. I'm here with a very special guest, Professor David Wilson. Now, David, can I call you David first of all?
Yes, that would be fine. That is my name, Stuart. So that would be okay.
I had a fear of calling you Professor Wilson throughout the duration of the interview, which would have been fine, but we'll call you David. Now, when I was researching your background, a lot of people listening to this will know who you are. You're an established name in true crime, but for those listening maybe across the borders in other countries, let me run through a very, very high level overview of your career and feel free to correct me where I go wrong.
Especially now, this will be very interesting, Stuart,
Yeah.
because whenever people, especially younger people like yourself, tell me that they've been researching my career, my heart immediately sinks and thinks, they've gone to Wikipedia. So
Well,
let me
no,
let
actually,
me let me see how many Wikipedias there are in what you're going to say.
well, I don't use Wikipedia. I've opted to use a few interviews that you've done with
Ah,
people.
okay.
So hopefully, what I'm going to say is more accurate than Wikipedia. So, and I want to say this word right. You are an emeritus professor. Am I saying that right? Emeritus.
Yeah, emeritus
Emeritus.
professor.
Emeritus professor of criminology at Birmingham City University.
Yes.
Highly respected criminologist. That goes without saying. And you've served in the prison service. You were the youngest prison governor in the UK at 29, I read. Is that still a fact that's correct?
It is as far as I know, and also that is a bit of there is a bit of I'm never quite sure how to explain this, but I was running a young offender institution, which was an open young offender institution when I was 28. But my rank at the time was assistant governor. So you could technically say, was he the governing governor? Was he the governor? But my rank at the time was assistant governor, but I was in charge of this very small place called Finnemore Wood, which is near Marlow in Buckinghamshire, which very sadly has closed down. I used to say, Stuart, you needed to get A levels to go into that young offender institution. It was a very exclusive small place that I ran as if it was a Duke of Edinburgh outward bound scheme. Um, so it was a really wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And I dealt with young men, boys, and young men who were very lightly convicted and could do all kinds of creative things with them. But that label gets attached to me because of my age, because I was in charge. But at the time, technically, I was still an assistant governor by rank as opposed to a governor by rank.
Did people still call you governor though?
Oh, gosh, yes, yes,
Well, that's the
yes.
main thing. You had
you
the
like
respect of the people there.
you like titles. I'm picking that up
I do,
already.
yeah.
Emeritus and
Yes.
governor.
I'm going to put Emeritus Professor David Wilson on this episode's description. I like, people have letters after the name. I just find the whole thing hilarious, if I'm being honest. Maybe I'm
I,
just jealous.
Which title would you like? What would you like to be have if there was a Lord Stuart, His
I'd take
Honor,
Lord.
the
I'd take
Honourable
Lord.
Stuart? What would you take?
Well, I did buy my friend once. You can buy like a square foot of land on a Scottish estate and you can
Yes.
call yourself Lord. I did buy my friend that one time. But on my Patreon tiers, because it's British murders, my levels are MBE, OBE, and CBE.
Yes.
So that's enough for me. I don't need letters after my name. I do feel like sometimes with the end of year awards, they get given out to, like Gareth Southgate's just been knighted. I don't know how much I agree with that personally.
I was supportive of it. I thought he did enough to warrant
You
that.
think? Okay.
And I just was sad. I think the only sadness that I had that was Kevin Sinfield didn't get knighted. I thought that kind of was a poor show in terms of the awards system. I mean, he raised, who I just thought was very heroic in the last stages of Rob Burrows' life and publicising what had happened. And I did think it played on that British obsession of class, didn't it? That there was a northern
Yeah.
and a southern element flavor to what was happening. But yeah, I can understand why people in this country are really obsessed by titles. So what you're saying isn't unusual. It's one of the things. And I mean, some people will introduce me as, ladies and gentlemen, Emeritus Professor David Wilson. And I immediately go, well, that's so nice. Where else do you get introduced by all your work, degrees, and titles?
It's something you've earned. And I mean, touching on Kevin Sinfield just briefly, because I live in Leeds, the Rob Borough Marathon. Wonderful to see the amount of people that come, but it's a nightmare for traffic if you want to get out. You have to.
And have you run it yet,
I've
Stuart?
not. No, no.
There's a New Year's resolution for you, isn't
Well, it's one of those, where you see a marathon going on and you think, I could do that. I could
it?
run. I could run a marathon, but then you wake up the next day and give your head a wobble.
No, you
So
could run a marathon. I've run several and several half marathons.
I'll start with a 5K first. What do you
Well,
think?
well, you've got to start somewhere, but you've got to
Exactly.
decide you want to do it.
That's it. That's the bit I'm having trouble with. Let's bring it back to your career, David.
Oh
You've
yes, yours.
we'll bring it back on topic. You've authored uncountable number of books.
Because
I'm not
learn
gonna
with
quote it. I'm not gonna
Wikipedia.
quote it because I'll get it wrong. I'll get it wrong if I quote how many books there are. A lot, let's say a lot. I was a bit overwhelmed, I'll be honest. When you put David Wilson, Professor David Wilson, into Google or any search engine, the amount of information is immense. And when I told my Facebook group and my Patreon members that I was speaking to you today, the response I received was unbelievable. I knew you're a big name in true crime, but do you realize how many people are so appreciative of the work you've done over the years?
But that's very. I'm always humbled by those kinds of statements, and obviously I've been on tour last year, the year before, and a few years before that, and so I meet members of the public as part of being on tour, and the way one would normally meet other folk, and I'm always very humbled by their reaction to me. But sometimes I worry, Stuart, that a lot of that is based on kind of media stereotypes about what I do and who I've worked with and the kind of applied work that I would still be engaged on. Because there definitely is a sense in which I think the public imagine that I'm working with serial murderers every day. And that's clearly not what a criminologist would do generally. And specifically, I know I do that work. I sometimes think what they're reacting to, as humbling as it is not necessarily an accurate reflection of who I am and what I've done.
Do you ever feel like this character of you has been built, I suppose? And do you ever feel yourself being David, the man at home, the family man, and then David, if you're doing a talk or you're on tour, do you feel like you have a persona that you put on?
Yes, there's very clearly a public David Wilson and a private David Wilson, and I occasionally allow the two to meet one another. I do very consciously allow my private life to bleed into the public life as a way of countering some popular misconceptions, either about me or about my work. For example, I think people think that I'm haunted, that I must be in some kind of dark place constantly. So I started very consciously to allow people to know I love rugby, I have a family life, I walk a great deal. I very consciously brought my private David Wilson into the public David Wilson sphere. The other thing to say to you, Stuart, though, being on tour, and to puncture some of this pomposity that you're hearing from me, is that I increasingly get recognized, which I always put down to being on This Morning as a regular, or working with the wonderful Amelia Fox on Channel 4. And people nod at me. They kind of nod at me as they pass me in the street or as I'm getting a cup of tea or whatever it might be in a cafe. And this man, and it's incredibly humbling on one level, but this man nodded at me, nudged his wife, and I sat down, or a woman I presumed was his wife, and I sat down with my cup of tea, and he came up to me as I was having my tea. And you know that phrase, pride comes before a fall?
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Excuse me." And I rather preeningly went, "Yes." And he said, "Are you Graham Norton?" And that kind of takes it back into reality, as
Oh,
opposed to this kind of media constructed person that I'm often mistaken for.
that is funny. I do see it a little bit. I won't lie.
It's the beard, I know.
Yeah,
But
it's-
listen, I've also had in the last tour People thought I had the Graham Norton incident. I have somebody say George Galloway. Do you remember George Galloway?
Over my head, that.
He was a politician, became famous by being on Celebrity Big Brother with Rula Lenska and impersonating a cat. But he's the Scottish guy, and so I think the accent counted there. And once when I was filming, somebody asked if I was Sean Connery, and I said, "Well, he's been dead for 6 years." So
Oh God, that is just you don't know how to take that, do but I suppose it's a compliment in the grand scheme of things.
I think it's just facial recognition. People sort of recognize you, are trying to make sense of it. The accent is quite unusual. It's a very soft Scottish accent, but clearly Scottish.
Hmm.
And I think that's what gives clues that take people in one direction or another.
Is that accent something that's come through your time in England, or is that something from where you're based up north?
I went to school for a couple of years in America, and then I went
Right.
to university in England. And so I've lived my life in England since I was a very young man. And therefore, for me, it would be really unusual not to have a much more anglicized accent. But my sisters still live in Glasgow. And when I go back to Glasgow, I know how to put it on a bit more. I
Yeah.
know how to kind of get a bit more edgy in what I'm saying and how I say it. Because, of course, I don't want to ever be seen in Scotland as a soft Sassenach. So
Hmm.
you've got to be really careful.
I get that, yeah. I've got family in Edinburgh on my granddad's side, and some of my relatives, they live in, the Midlands, as English as you could be. As soon as they cross the border, the accent comes out. It's hilarious. When you know how they really speak, I just think it's really funny.
The other thing about going back to Scotland, because of course I did a BBC Scotland series for 4 seasons called Crime Files. And when I went back, it wasn't so much the accent that I noted, it was more body language. The Scottish body language is far sharper and harsher and more kind of pointed, whereas the English body language seems a bit more relaxed and softer. And so, for example, it would drive my friends in Glasgow insane if I went to the bar because I would never get served. I could never get the barman's eye. I could never get the beer, the rounding. And to the extent they would go, "You mustn't go to the bar. This is how it's done in Glasgow." And it definitely was a body language kind of message. I didn't really give the messages out that suggested that I wanted to be served.
It is fun up there. I do like it in Scotland. It is a different world, isn't it? Even though it's just up there somewhere. When we went to Glasgow for CrimeCon one time and I was in there, I forget the name of the statue. You know the statue with the cone on its head?
Yes,
Just
yes.
stuff like that, the local legends and just it's just a great place. And the
It's
countryside is beautiful as well.
It's Wellington statue, and
That's it.
it's a bit like if the cone goes is removed from his head, it's a bit like the ravens leaving the Tower of London. Something
Yeah.
dreadful will happen to
Yeah.
the state of Scotland. But you know, one of the things again, you went up for CrimeCon, and one of the difficulties that so often I have in England is that I try to explain. Glasgow was once in 2006. Glasgow had more murders per capita than any other city in Europe. Glasgow was the murder capital of Europe. And within 10 years, it had reduced its murder rate by 60%. And it's an astonishing achievement through something called the Glasgow Violence Reduction Strategy, now, of course, called the Scottish Violence Reduction Strategy. But whenever I would talk about that to people that I knew in the Met, who had me to do some training or who were talking to me more informally, I would talk about the Scottish Violence Reduction Strategy. And it was so obvious that they didn't want to acknowledge what had been done in Scotland because it hadn't been invented in England. And it
Right.
was really, really, really interesting that the Scots, for whatever reason, that violence reduction strategy is an amazing success. But it was almost impossible to get people in England to think about, well, could you copy some of that violence reduction strategy? And even next Monday, Stuart, the Glaswegians are opening up the Thistle. I don't know if you've heard of the Thistle, but it will be the first safer drug consumption room in the whole of the United Kingdom. You will be able to inject heroin in this safer drug consumption room under the guidance of medical professionals. The first time this has been tried. And again, it's just something about the Scottish approach to criminal justice, which I find the English should be trying to cherry pick things that they're doing that work. Obviously, ignore the things that don't work, but the things that they do that work. I mean, I find that kind of parochialism in England really rather depressing. You know, what is it the Scots are doing? What can you steal from the Scots? What can you steal from the Norwegians? What can you steal from the Portuguese that you might be able to harness and use within the English and Welsh criminal justice systems?
Just sound like stubbornness, doesn't it, really? We're not prepared to, we haven't come up with it. We don't want to do it. Just coming back to the Glasgow stuff briefly before we move on to Murder UK while we're here. Do you know, first of all, why that murder rate was so high? And secondly, what does this strategy consist of that helped reduce it so
Yeah,
significantly?
those are fair questions. I think there are historic and structural things. And those historic and structural things that created the murder rate have a lot to do with poverty, unemployment, deindustrialization, and a performance of masculinity. So those are all the kind of the big things that might take the PhD student down a particular rabbit hole to consider. But the things that were within the strategy that seem to me to be worth people in the English and Welsh criminal justice system stealing related to having a holistic approach as opposed to a criminal justice approach, having a healthcare approach as opposed to having a criminal justice approach. For example, ways of dealing with underlying drug and alcohol abuse issues, rather than seeing that as a responsibility for the police, seeing that as a responsibility for healthcare. Same with mental health issues, housing issues, education. A lot of these things, as you will know, given your background in terms of what you're interested in, a lot of these things start in childhood. A lot of these things are about young boys in particular learning how to be boys, how to be men, and the messages that are given out in our culture about how that masculinity is performed. And of course, what we've done is leave a lot of that at the moment to social media influencers like the Tate brothers. And I mean, that is absolutely toxic. And until my generation of men talk to your generation of men, and your generation of men talk to boys and young boys coming through into the next generation of men, we're never really going to tackle some of that problem. And what really struck me, though, was just the innovation of the Glasgow violence reduction strategy. Everything from one tiny example, if I may, these young men who were in trouble with the police, especially about knife carrying or using violence. The police have had, years, decades, centuries to try and tackle that problem. And what they tried to do under the violence reduction strategy was get the mothers of young men who'd been murdered, stabbed to death, to talk to young men who were carrying knives. People were required to attend. And all they did was get the mums of young men who'd been murdered, talk to these young men who were knife carrying. And I know from people who were there, it was an absolutely cathartic experience. Now, I don't know, I haven't followed up since that meeting, did they stop carrying knives or anything like that? But I know at the time it struck me as being, everybody likes their mum. And suddenly, if you're having mums telling you that these are the circumstances in which I lost my son, he was 16, he looked like you, he probably went to the same schools as you, he probably supported the same football team as you. If you hear a mum talk about losing her son in the circumstances that those mothers were grieving, it had a cathartic impact on the young men that were there. And the proof of the pudding was just that figure. In 2006, Glasgow was the murder capital of Europe. 10 years later, it's reduced its murder rate by 60%. The interesting thing, of course, because here being a Scot, Stuart, I like puncturing pomposity. In 2006, Glasgow was not only the murder capital of Europe, it was voted Europe's friendliest city.
Never. God. Talk about an oxymoron. That's incredible. What would you say has been the proudest moment of your career? It's probably hard to pick one, and it's quite a broad question, but is there anything that springs to mind as soon as I ask that?
Yeah, it's been about my career long attempt to get people to stop talking about serial killers and what might motivate them, and to get them instead to think about the groups of people that serial killers are able to predate upon. Serial killers in this country have only targeted five groups of people. In the main, doesn't work for 100% of the victims, but in the main, serial killers have only targeted five groups of people, and four of those groups are female. Only one group of men gets targeted by and large, and those are men who are gay or bisexual. And the two groups of women that are targeted most regularly are sex workers and women over the age of 60. And a lot of my career has been about saying, as somebody who's worked with serial murderers, stop trying to work out what their motivation is to kill, because their motivation can be either banal or so bizarre it's of no use to you. So let's look instead at the groups that get murdered. Because if we challenged homophobia, if we had a grown up debate about sex work and how it's policed, and above all, if we try to give a voice to older people in our culture, in our community, and stop seeing them as a burden, and started to question when they were 72 and the good local GP turns up and gives them the flu jab, and by the afternoon they're dead. If we started to think about those issues and target those issues in our public policy, we would do a lot more to reduce the incidence of serial murder than thinking about what might be motivating a serial killer to kill. That's been my biggest career long defining element to my work, to try and stop people in that very FBI way thinking about how the serial killer somehow has an insight into the phenomenon of serial murder, and instead make people think about the groups that they're able to kill, because why those groups are vulnerable is what we have to do to reduce the incidence of serial murder.
Do you think the interest in serial murderers is something that's, how can I word this? When I started 4 and a bit years ago, my first few seasons were named after the killers as opposed to the victims. Since going to stuff like CrimeCon, hearing from victims' families, doing talks and stuff, you realize then that this is real. Whereas it's, if you're just reading something, watching a documentary, it's quite easy to think that it's fictional when it actually contains real life families and people are suffering still. So I've shifted to a victim focused approach, but there are still people out there that are fascinated with the killers. You see Netflix shows focusing on the murderers. You see people using murderers monikers and nicknames, which some people don't like. I'm just curious, how do you think that has changed while you've been attempting to raise awareness that we need to look at the victims more than the perpetrators?
Well, it's a very big question, and it's a very good question. And I'm not pretending that I have all the answers. But can I tell you, I wrote a book about what was happening in Ipswich in 2006 called Hunting Evil, about the five women that were murdered by Steve Wright. And that book was the first ever book in this country to have the photographs of the five women on the front cover, as
Wow.
opposed to a photograph of the killer on the cover. I kind of was very conscious that I wanted that to happen. And that book was published in 2007, 2008, I think. And so that for me is the beginning of an awareness that let's stop talking about the killer and talk about why these victims get targeted. I think it's got something to do with where we started. Your clever question about, is there a TV David Wilson and a real David Wilson, and how the two, sometimes I'm performing David Wilson as opposed to being David Wilson. And I think that has something to do with the public's perception of serial murderers themselves. And a lot of those programs that you've been describing, and the podcasts that you've been talking about, and the books that get written by some authors, make them much more than who they are. They glamorize them much more than who. I mean, Ted Bundy's the best example. Ted Bundy was not particularly handsome. Ted Bundy was not
I agree.
particularly
I don't
clever.
get that at all.
Ted Bundy wasn't this great guy that would have been, any girl that brought Ted Bundy home, her parents would have been delighted to have met him. He was such a wonderful guy. Ted Bundy wasn't like that at all. But of course, successive iterations of books or movies have always cast one of the most handsome actors in Hollywood to play Ted Bundy. So people then end up imagining that that was what Ted Bundy was like, whereas he was very different to that media portrayal. And I think that plays a part in it. The other part that gets played in it is the high prison walls don't just keep, obviously, Ted Bundy in the United States was executed, but the high prison walls don't just keep prisoners, violent offenders inside, they keep the public outside. And because they keep the public outside, that allows a lot of these myths, this kind of imagining of what they have done and who they are like, to take hold. And again, one of the things that I did in my time as a prison governor and still do, and you can come, I'll invite you the next time. But one of the things that I did in my time as a prison governor was make sure that the public got to come in and see the prison. Let the public in. This is their tax money that is paying for this condition, these conditions inside. Let them look at what is happening. Obviously, there were controls over that. It wasn't just you could ring the bell and come in. But equally, to this day, I still invite 12 people a year to have lunch at HMP Grendon, the only prison in the whole of Europe that operates as a psychodynamic therapeutic community. I invite people in to have lunch with the prisoners, to meet the staff, and to go into a very, very informal therapy session with the prisoners so that people get to see this is what can be done in a prison. And after every lunch that I do in that respect, people are always overwhelmed by it. They're like, I had no idea. They were like this. The prisoners were like this. I imagined they were going to be like something else. And that's because those high prison walls that keep them behind those walls, rightly, in my view, those high prison walls allow the public's imagination about what those people are going to be like to just take full flow. And it doesn't take them to anywhere that's authentic and real.
I bet that's an amazing experience.
Come.
I'll go. I'd happily go. That'd be amazing.
Come. Yeah, that would be great.
The story will continue after these quick messages. And now, back to the story.
Just touching back on the book about the Ipswich murders, I'm curious because I think a lot of people focus on the killers more for marketing purposes. I'm wondering if you had any pushback when you were adamant on wanting to feature the faces of those women as opposed to focusing on Steve Wright. Did you have any pushback, or was that something that you were fully in control of?
I had no pushback on it at all. And actually, I have stuck with that publisher ever since Little Brown and Sphere. Little Brown and Sphere is the imprint of Little Brown that publishes my work. And I've just got a new book that will come out later this year, still with Little Brown and Sphere, because they kind of got it immediately. And so I'm delighted always to have continued to work with them. Can I tell you, though, there's an interesting, something that's really interesting about what we've been discussing and that book. I wrote that book with a man called Paul Harrison, who was a Sky broadcast journalist. Paul Harrison, the Sky broadcast journalist. But there was also a true crime author called Paul Harrison. And Paul Harrison became this kind of media star, the true crime Paul Harrison, because he claimed that he had been trained by the FBI. He claimed he'd met Ted Bundy. He claimed he'd met untold numbers of American and British serial killers. And he was a complete fraud. But that Paul Harrison went on book tours, talking tours, and yet was eventually exposed by a journalist working for The Sun, because the journalist working for The Sun went to one of his talks and said, this can't be right. And so he started doing a bit of fact checking about Paul Harrison and realized it was, in fact, a fraud. So that sense in which this world becomes fascinating for members of the public, but is equally fascinating for people who want to claim to be offender profilers, who've met serial killers, is just as attractive to them. And so I constantly have to say, whenever I mention the book that I wrote about Ipswich, which is called Hunting Evil, that I wrote the book with Paul Harrison, the Sky broadcast journalist, because the fake Paul Harrison, as it were, started to claim that he had been writing with me, which isn't true. And in fact, on one of the books, he acknowledges me because I had written something about a Glasgow murderer called Bible John,
Yeah.
and he acknowledges me in the book. And I remember going, I've never spoken to him about any of this stuff. Why is he acknowledging me? But he was a fraud. And he's not the only one. There are Stéphane Bourgoin in France, claimed to have been an offender profiler trained by the FBI. In the United States, there are several people in the United States who've claimed to be profilers trained by the FBI, which simply isn't true. And so this fascination that this world that we share can have with people sometimes takes people into, well, places that they shouldn't have gone.
It's very bizarre. It's quite humorous, but then it's also fraud, right? So it's quite serious, in my opinion, that you're defrauding people to see you on tour and stuff.
Well, in terms of that Paul Harrison, at least he was not putting people behind bars. In the United States, there is somebody who claimed to have criminology, offender profiling experience and was giving evidence on behalf of the state prosecution systems of the states in which he was giving that evidence. People have gone to prison based on his evidence and only now are being released because he's been exposed as being fraudulent.
Just one final career-based question, because I'm cautious we haven't yet really talked about Murder UK. If you could go back and give yourself advice, what would you get? Have any regrets, I guess, is another question in your career. Would you do anything differently if you had the chance?
I sometimes, as I've got older, I resigned from the prison service after 13 years, I think, 13, 14 years, I forget. And I sometimes think, and I resigned as a result of going out to Albania on behalf of the Council of Europe and advising the new democratic government of Albania about setting up their penal system. And when I got back from that visit, I kind of thought, I'm not doing this anymore. And I sometimes think as I've got older, maybe I should have stayed. Maybe I should have dug in and stayed as opposed to return to academia. But that would be the only kind of regret I think that I had. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if I dug in and spent 30 years working in that culture as opposed to 13 or 14.
Well, your new series, Murder UK.
Well done. Good segue, Stuart.
The reason why we're here, ultimately. Now, as of recording, we're recording this on January 6th, but this episode, for people listening, is being released on January 13th, which is the premiere of Murder UK on True Crime.
Yes.
So that airs, if I'm time traveling, tonight, January 13th at 10 p.m. And it airs on True Crime on Mondays and Tuesdays. There's 10 episodes in this series. They're all British murder cases, and they range from the earliest is 1998, and then the latest, I believe, is 2019. And
that's right.
It's David looking at the psychological and sociological forces that drive individuals to kill. That's straight from the media kit. That's not me being good with words. Now, I have seen the first episode. I was sent a screener. Thank you for that, True Crime. And it's brilliantly put together. Since I started my podcast, I'm not someone who consumes much true crime anymore.
Yeah.
A bit of a busman's holiday. But this really gripped me. Now, I don't know if that's because of the story, because it focuses on Wayne Coventry, this first episode. And this is a bit of a unique case in which a man is in a toxic relationship with a woman who is being abusive, both mentally, emotionally, and violently towards him, which we don't often see. But before we come on to that episode, I just wonder, how did this series come about? When were you first aware of this concept?
I was asked if I would consider doing this. And like you, I'm very cautious about true crime. True crime as a label hides a wide variety of product. And there's a kind of true crime product, which is, for want of a better phrase, a kind of pilot high and sell it cheap kind of product. And I only like to become involved in true crime that's genuinely going to introduce the viewer to something that's new and make them think and involves the family and is very careful about the kinds of information that will be shared. Again, as I've got older, Stuart, I recognize I have to self censor quite a lot about the information that I could offer. And I've realized that there will be some people who will take that information and not use it in the way that I'd want. So I'm very careful about lending my support to a series. And what I liked about this series, when we were speaking about it before it was made, was that I wanted the series to be about the reality of murder. And I wanted to introduce the viewer, therefore, into some, I think they're called dark truths. And those dark truths are, you're more likely to be murdered in your home than in an outdoor public place like a street or an alleyway or an indoor public space like a pub or a club. You know, the place where murder takes place in Britain is in the home. And so a lot of the dark truths are about relationships that are going to go badly wrong. The second thing that I wanted and was delighted to see in the series was I wanted to introduce the viewer to a range of experts, but in particular Jane Monckton Smith and her domestic homicide timeline, because a lot of the examples that we provide, you can actually see the timeline come to life, as it were, in terms of the issues that are emerging. And so I wanted that dark truth to come into play as well. And then in terms of the first episode, you are right. This is an unusual one to start the series with, but nonetheless, it still is about a toxic relationship. It's still about where on that homicide timeline you could place where the murder takes place. It still occurs within the room that is the most common room where somebody will be murdered in Britain, the kitchen, using a kitchen knife. And although the murder of Wayne Coventry by his partner, Cordelia Farrell, has an elements to it that are unique, I wanted to start the series with that because I felt it kind of just grabbed attention in the way it's grabbed your attention.
Absolutely.
It kind of is like, oh, hang on a minute, this is, yeah, what's this about? Obviously, in Cordelia Farrell's case, there's an underlying personality disorder. She's got what used to be called borderline personality disorder, but now it's called emotionally unstable personality disorder. So there's an element of that that's unique. And clearly, what's unique is that it's a woman killing a man as opposed to a man killing a woman. The other episodes are about men killing women, sadly. 2 women a week are murdered by their partners or ex-partners in Britain. But we come on to that kind of murder in later episodes. So that's what really attracted me. I wanted this to be prestige true crime as opposed to the pilot high sell it cheap true crime. I wanted the viewer to be introduced to some things that were new, to meet experts that they might not have heard speak before. And I think Jane Monckton Smith's work is extraordinary. And in later episodes, you're going to hear Nazir Afzal, for example, talk about some of his work, a former senior Crown prosecutor, who, of course, has come back into the frame as we're speaking, because, of course, Elon Musk has made all those dreadful comments on X about grooming gangs, and Nazir's work has been about tackling some of those grooming gangs. So that's the reason why I was attracted to it, because I felt that we were genuinely dealing with new information that the viewer would find instructive and helpful.
I was sent a list of episode summaries. I've only seen the first one, as I said, but I was sent a list of the summaries. It looks like a lot of them are about coercive control, domestically abusive relationships. I looked at the ONS, I forget what the O stands, Office for National Statistics, I guess,
Yes.
is what it is. The latest data states there were 100 domestic homicides in the year ending March 2023. I did make a note about the kitchen comment, but you've sort of covered that for me. Thank you. How involved were you in choosing these cases? You mentioned that you sort of had a bit of influence with the order, but did you actually choose them?
No, I didn't choose the cases. There was a kind of rough idea of which cases that we would like to look at. And I could say, oh, I can talk about these things if we took that case. We can talk about different things if we take that case. So I became involved at that stage. And often, for example, you've got to remember that if you want the family involved, sometimes families don't want to talk about what happened to their loved one. And therefore, I might want to choose a case, but it's impossible to get the family to discuss it. It's impossible to get the SIO to discuss it. There is no body cam footage that we'd be able to use that could bring the episodes to life. I mean, it's very different in the United States. I mean, in the United States, under freedom of information, you could get everything in relation to what I've just described. But in this country, there are different broadcasting rules. There are different rules in relation to government agencies wanting to have work that they have been doing on TV. So a lot of the cases that I wanted us to discuss, we just weren't able to do. And in relation to this first case, for example, we got Wayne's brother to talk about him. We got Wayne's father to talk about him. Getting the family to agree to discuss what happens seems to me to add an entirely new dimension to it for the reason that you and I spoke about earlier. This is about remembering the victim, not about glorifying or dwelling on the macabre nature, the bizarre nature, the banal nature of the offender. And that's why it's really important to get the family involved as well.
What's your opinion on the entertainment aspect of documentaries such as this? Because you sort of mentioned there how some cases either the family doesn't want to be involved, there's not much information available, whether that be body cam footage or research or documents you're able to acquire. It's the same when researching an episode for myself. It's different levels, of course, but there's sometimes not enough information to fill an episode's length, I guess, which is a shame because it's still someone whose life has ended. Their story's still worth telling. But for the sake of an episode, it doesn't work. So I'm curious as to what your opinion is on that. Do you ever feel, I'd love to cover that, but we can't because it does, at the end of the day, still have to appeal to an audience that's watching?
I mean, for me, it's not so much that last observation that you made, but one of the earlier observations that you made in your question. For me, if the family doesn't want us to do the episode, we don't do the episode.
Yeah.
Because it's that that brings the victim to life. And the family has got to find a way of finding closure in terms of what happened to their loved one. And sometimes that is about talking to the media about what it is that happened. The entertainment side of it is that I always have taken the view that I'm in a world in which people are going to consume the information, the work that I do in ways that they find entertaining. But what I've got to do is get the audience to also sit there and think about what it is that they're being shown. And what they're being shown might show them that, look, this is how toxic relationships begin. Here are the red flags that you should be aware of. Here are the circumstances that you should avoid if they come into your life. I've always said an interest in true crime is not only normal, it's actually necessary. Because if you know the circumstances in which you're likely to fall victim to a violent crime, you can choose to avoid those violent circumstances. And I think it's also necessary in our public policy because if we know, which we do, the circumstances in which men and women are going to be murdered, then we could reduce those circumstances in the way that I described to you about how to reduce the incidence of serial murder in Britain. It's not something that we just have to accept for me, this is, again, back to my career, this has been about saying to people, you can be empowered to do something to prevent this from continuing to happen. And again, in relation to the overarching story, and you mentioned the ONS, domestic homicide figures, that goes back to our earlier conversation, Stuart, about the performance of masculinity, and not seeing masculinity as singular, but as plural. There are multiple masculinities. There are multiple ways of being a man. And it's about older men talking to younger men about that fact and how they could perform masculinity. You know, at the end of the day, murder, and this is a murder podcast, at the end of the day, 9 out of 10 murders are solved. 90% of murder gets cleared up. And that's done not because of offender profilers or DNA evidence or forensic science. That's done because the victim and the perpetrator are usually in some form of relationship. And if we ignore for a second the domestic homicide relationship, the bulk of murder in Britain is 16 to 24-year-old young men killing other 16 to 24-year-old young men. And often their murders are taking place in circumstances in which they feel they've lost face. They feel that they have been disrespected. And it's about, again, that takes us back into this concept of masculinity and how we therefore have to start talking to young men about the performance of masculinity.
Why do you think in a case such as Wayne's that a man being abused by a woman is still taboo in this day and age? Because you mentioned masculinity and generations need to speak to other generations below them to make them aware that stuff like that isn't okay. It's not an insult to your masculinity. You can speak out about it, but why is that still so taboo even in now 2025?
Yeah, and in fact, without making it sound rather grand, it's one of the reasons we chose this as the first episode to go out, that we wanted people to see this is a man that's going to be killed, and it shouldn't be taboo. I mean, one of the things I've had to share about my own life, and if you've done the research, which I know already you have, listening to what we've been doing, you will know I got stalked. I got stalked really badly, and my stalker eventually had to be sectioned. And I was stalked by a man. And I felt ashamed talking about that. I felt kind of like I had to make a joke about it. I had to pretend that everything was fine. Whereas in fact, this was a man that was threatening to kill me. And I quote, "I'll stab you repeatedly until you're dead." It's one of the reasons why I always talk about Stalking Awareness Week. It's one of the reasons why I liked Baby Reindeer, because at least people were beginning to talk about issues that we should be open to talk about. And in relation to men being murdered, not necessarily men who are the victims of domestic abuse, but in relation to men being murdered, remember, murder is a male phenomenon. 9 out of 10 perpetrators of murder are male, which surprises no one. But usually what surprises them when I'm on my book tours or theatre tours, and I say 7 out of 10 victims of murder are men. The figure 2 women a week are murdered by their partners or ex-partners is a genuine statistic. And thankfully, people are aware of that, and we're trying to do things to reduce that terrible number. But are people aware that 7 out of 10 victims of murder are men who are murdered by other men? And so this is a male phenomenon, and it's about men owning that phenomenon and trying to do something about it.
I think one of the interesting things about Wayne's case as well was the fact that authorities were involved, because escalation is something I discuss quite often in my episodes. Something happens and something further happens, and ultimately it ends in Wayne's murder. And there was a non-molestation order put in place, which essentially is meant to prevent the perpetrator from contacting the victim. Is it just in domestic abuse that? Can you just talk a bit about non-molestation orders? Because that was a new term on me.
You have summarized it perfectly.
Okay.
But I think what your question was hinting at, which is the unknown act, isn't it? Because what we're always dealing with is failure in series such as this, aren't we? We're always dealing with when it goes wrong, it doesn't work. Whereas in fact, we don't know the number of times those non-molestation orders do work. And we don't know those numbers of times when the various authorities can intervene, the families can intervene. Nobody in Wayne's family was unaware of how toxic the relationship was. And they kept trying to talk to him about that relationship as a way of ending the relationship. And so it's just about beginning to see through the circumstances in which a family feels empowered to intervene in a way that they might not have chosen to intervene in the past. And we can use formal or semi-formal interventions like the non-molestation order. But often these are about interpersonal interventions. These are about people saying, a friend saying, look, I think this is not healthy and you've got to stop, you've got to change, you've got to stop seeing this person. Therefore, the series is also about allowing people, again, using Jane Monckton Smith's work, to just have some red flags flying. So, for example, that very first stage on the journey that you'll end up in a set of circumstances that Wayne ended up in with Cordelia Farrell would be that love bombing stage. That first stage where love comes very easily, very quickly, very intensely. And it's that's the red flag. That love doesn't happen like that. Love is often a very gradual and drawn out process, as opposed to one that seems to happen in a week. So often one sees in these stories that first stage being about someone desperate for love, desperate to be validated, and feeling that they have found the right person in their life at last. Well, one hopes that that does happen for them, but that's also a red flag. And so often the perpetrators in these episodes have had a history of stalking and had a history of coercive control in the past, which again, people can now get access to that information more formally. If you are starting a new relationship, you can contact the police to say, does Joanna Blogs have anything that I should be concerned about in terms of their criminal convictions? So it's about introducing people to those ideas, I think, the series will allow. The other thing that comes out is, again, I was very keen to show staging behaviors, which again is a very American concept that people don't talk about in Britain. I was very keen. I remember annoying the producer quite a bit, saying, can we get some stuff in? I want to talk about staging behaviors, because how perpetrators are very skilled at constructing a version of events that suits them and deflects attention away from them as the perpetrator. So quite apart from, this kind of domestic homicide timeline, the sense in which the kitchen is often the site where murder will take place, and kitchen knives, the knife block is the British equivalent of the AK-47, to be perfectly honest, and some elements of staging behavior. I thought that would bring new material to the viewing audience. And what did you think? You enjoyed it. I hope the first episode, you could be entertained by it. But I think from what you said, Stuart, you left after watching it thinking about things.
Yeah, it was harrowing, I would suggest. Especially for someone, I'm a year younger now than Wayne was when he was killed. He'd not long come out of a long-term relationship with his former partner with 3 kids, and he was desperately in need of love. So someone like Cordelia, it was a perfect fit, for better use of a term. Doesn't sound right when I'm saying that, but he wanted what she also wanted from the other side. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
And
there was a kind of mutual infatuation,
yeah.
wasn't there?
And what I did enjoy, David, is that you also covered Cordelia's emotionally unstable personality disorder, because I think sometimes we either have too much of a focus on one side or the other. I always like to portray both sides, not to justify what's happened, but just to give the audience a better understanding of what may have led to that, because she desperately needed affection as part of this disorder. She needed love all the time, reassurance, and she would do things because of it to provoke Wayne. And because he was so madly in love with her, he stayed with her. So I did appreciate that you covered her mental health side of it as well as Wayne's background.
Oh, well, thank you. Emotionally unstable personality disorder, I always describe to my students as it's like you're riding a roller coaster. One day you're high emotionally, everything is wonderful emotionally. And then the next day you've gone to the bottom of the roller coaster, everything is dark and depressing and gloomy, and life can't go on like this. And that kind of emotionally unstable personality disorder, which I'm old enough, I used to call that borderline personality disorder. You've got this strange amalgam of narcissism, a desperate desire to be validated, and an inability to be validated because you're on this roller coaster that will take you away from the validation after it's been given, because you can't accept that that should be given to you. And of course, there's again that thing about narcissism, isn't there, more popularly? People think narcissists are very self-obsessed people, which they are, but they think it's because they are very secure in their personality, whereas in fact narcissists are usually very insecure in their personality.
The final point I want to touch on is the sentence that Cordelia received.
Yes.
Researching this in some articles, you can comment on some newspapers' websites to voice your opinion. A lot of them don't let people do it, but one of them did. The most common thing I came across was that people were of the opinion that Cordelia was given a lenient sentence because she was a woman. And if this was a man who had killed a woman in a domestically abusive situation, it would have been far more severe. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, no, I mean, I understand why that's being said, but there are other, you will find out, no spoilers, you will find there are other episodes when a similar sentence will be given to the male perpetrator. She does have an underlying personality disorder. It was diagnosed. A number of psychiatrists agreed that that was her underlying personality. And I accept that people who are not competent in legal terms as a consequence of that personality disorder should be treated differently in terms of the sentence that they received. However, she's in prison for a long time. You know, it's not as if she's coming out this year.
Where would you suggest anyone go for resources if anyone's affected by the themes discussed throughout this series? Where would you pinpoint them to go?
Well, and that's such a lovely question at the end. Thank you. I always recommend the Susie Lamplugh Trust. I had a lot to do with Diana Lamplugh, Susie's mother, who's passed. Both Susie's mother and father have both passed. And I always think that in terms of domestic abuse, in terms of women's safety, in terms of advice about stalking, whether that be a man or a woman that's being stalked, that the Lamplugh Trust still has the best resources in terms of help and where you can go to get help. So I would recommend that.
Well, David, it's been lovely speaking to you. Thanks for your time. Just a reminder for everyone that Murder UK starts tonight, January 13th. I'm time traveling again. At 10 p.m. on True Crime. It airs Mondays and Tuesdays. There's 10 episodes, all featuring David, all British murder cases. I hope you enjoyed that. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for speaking to me.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you for your questions. And you didn't ask a Wikipedia research question, which makes me even prouder of you, Stuart.
Thank you.